Counselor Vex Ilbrin had reviewed 11,000 mercenary contracts in her career, and she had never once seen a client leave every payment field blank. Not underpaid. Not disputed. Blank. The human's name sat at the bottom of the standard Concord arbitration ledger. Rin Caswell, independent contractor, class, unlisted, beside a compensation clause that simply read, to be determined upon completion by the client's own judgment, with no ceiling and no floor. No Merc alive signed that clause. No Merc alive would have to. It was, by every rule of Concord contract law, an invitation to be cheated. He'd signed it anyway. 6 months ago. For a client who was, as of 40 minutes ago, dead. Vex set the data slate down on her desk and looked at the security feed instead, the human standing motionless in the council's outer chamber, hands folded, saying nothing, while a room full of the galaxy's most powerful beings tried to decide whether to arrest him or thank him. She did not yet understand which one he deserved. Neither, it would turn out, did he. The client had been Ambassador Torv Senak of the Ethrenic Concordance, a minor diplomatic post nobody in the council took especially seriously, right up until the moment Senak's private shuttle was found adrift with its entire crew dead and one human standing calmly in the cargo hold, unarmed, uninjured, waiting to be found. That was the first mystery, and it planted itself in the room the instant the security footage started playing. A man who should have been the obvious suspect, behaving like someone who had already decided the outcome didn't frighten him. "Explain the bodies," said Counselor Reth Amarai, first speaker of the assembly, a Vaskai elder whose species had not lost a war in 400 years and had, as a professional courtesy, never once needed to raise its voice to win an argument. 6 crew. 1 ambassador. All dead before your ship was intercepted. You were the only one alive aboard a vessel with no breach, no distress signal, and no record of hostile boarding. They died of cortixin toxin, Rin said. His voice was low, even, unbothered by the 12 pairs of alien eyes fixed on him. Aerosolized. Odorless above trace concentration. It was in the ambassador's private stateroom air recycler. I found it 40 minutes after we departed the station, which was roughly 35 minutes too late for everyone but me. Convenient, said Counselor Vex, that you survived a toxin fatal to 6 other beings aboard the same vessel. Not convenient. Slow. Something flickered behind Ren's expression, gone before anyone could name it. Human tolerance to that particular compound is higher than most Concord species. I didn't survive because I was clever, Counselor. I survived because my body took longer to die, and I spent that extra time trying to save people who didn't have it. That was the second mystery, dropped like a stone into still water. Not how the human had lived, but the strange, clipped restraint in the way he described it. A man reciting a fact he had clearly relived a great many times already, in a great many rooms, and had stopped expecting anyone to actually believe. The third mystery arrived 30 seconds later, and it was the one that would not let go of the room for the rest of the hearing. Ambassador Senak's final transmission, said Counselor Amarai, gesturing, and a garbled, half-degraded audio file filled the chamber, a voice, weak, speaking in Ethrenic dialect, cut off mid-syllable. The council's translation core rendered it instantly onto the display. Tell the human he was right about, and then nothing. Static. A dead channel. Right about what? Nobody in that chamber knew. Rin Caswell, standing very still at the center of it, did not offer to explain. 6 months earlier, on a border station nobody important ever visited, Ambassador Torv Senak had hired a human mercenary for a job so undersized it should never have crossed a council record at all. Personal security, indefinite term, for an aging diplomat nobody currently wanted dead. That, at least, was the official framing. It was the first thing about this case the council got catastrophically wrong, though it would take them most of the hearing to realize it. You were hired as a bodyguard, Counselor Vex said, reviewing the contract again. A menial post. Beneath the notice of any serious operative. Why would a human of your evident skill accept work this far beneath your capability? Because he asked, Rin said. That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got. A pause, longer than any he'd allowed himself yet. Senak wasn't important to anyone in this room. I understand that. He was important to the 11,000 refugees his office was quietly relocating off a border world your council had already written off as strategically unsalvageable. Nobody paid me to protect a diplomat, counselor. I took the job because I read what he was actually doing with a post everyone else considered a punishment posting, and I decided it mattered whether he lived long enough to finish it. The room went very quiet. This was the first true misinterpretation the council made about Ren Caswell, and it was foundational. They had assumed a human accepting an unglamorous, low-status contract signaled limited options, limited value, a mercenary who took what he could get. They discovered, 6 months too late to matter, that he had simply been the only operative in the sector who'd bothered to read past the job title before deciding whether the work was worth doing. "You are telling this council," said a new voice, sharp, skeptical, cutting through the murmurs, "that you accepted an open-ended, undervalued, effectively unpaid contract out of altruism." The speaker was Enforcer Marshal Croth Oshuin, Concord Internal Security, a Dravath officer whose species prized calculated risk above nearly every other virtue and viewed uncompensated sacrifice the way most beings viewed a structural design flaw. Not admirable, simply inefficient, evidence of an error somewhere upstream that a competent engineer would have caught. Oshuin did not believe in altruism. He believed in incentives he hadn't yet identified. "I'm telling you I read a file and decided a man's work was worth protecting," Ren said. "Whether you call that altruism or bad business is your problem, not mine. Everything has a price, human. I have spent 11 years reading beings who claim otherwise, and every one of them was hiding the actual transaction somewhere I hadn't looked yet." "Then keep looking, Enforcer Marshal," Ren said, and for the first time, something almost like a smile crossed his face, thin, humorless, entirely unafraid. "You won't find it. Not because I'm better at hiding it than the others. Because it isn't there." Oshuin did not believe him. That disbelief would nearly get several more people killed before the hearing was through. The council recessed to review the shuttle's forensic data, and it was here, in the gap between accusation and evidence, the space the pacing of this entire crisis kept insisting on filling with new and worse questions, that the danger of underestimating this particular human first became visible to anyone paying close attention. Vex found Ren alone in a holding corridor, seated on a bare bench, hands still folded, posture unchanged from the hearing room. He had not asked for water. He had not asked for legal counsel, which every species in the Concord was entitled to and every species in the Concord's history had, without exception, demanded within minutes of detainment. "You're not going to ask what happens to you," she said. "Would asking change it?" "No." "Then it's not a useful question yet." He looked up at her, and she was struck, not for the first time, by how little urgency lived in his face for a man facing a capital tribunal. "You want to ask me something else?" "Ask it." Vex hesitated, a hesitation she would examine later with real discomfort, because she was a counselor of the Concord Assembly and counselors of the Concord Assembly did not typically hesitate in front of prisoners. The ambassador's final words. He was right about what? "I don't know," Ren said, and something in his voice, for the very first time, did not sound entirely steady. "That's the part one can't give you, counselor. I've replayed that fragment 900 times since it happened and I don't know what he meant, and it is currently the single worst thing I have ever had to sit with, because I think it mattered, and I think I failed to hear the rest of it in time to do anything about it." It was a small admission. It should not have mattered as much as it did. But Vex had spent 11,000 contracts learning to read the particular silence of beings who had rehearsed their composure, and this was not that. This was a man who had simply run out of room to keep something contained, and had let it slip because there was, for one unguarded moment, nobody left to perform for. That was the fourth mystery, and it changed the shape of every mystery before it. This was not a mercenary calmly weathering an interrogation. This was a man privately convinced he had already failed at the one thing he'd actually taken the job to do. The forensic review took 6 hours, and every hour produced a fact that made the situation worse, not clearer, the specific compounding dread the council had not been braced for. The cortixin toxin, they learned, had not been improvised. It had been synthesized specifically to bypass Ithrenic and Voskei physiology while remaining lethal to both, meaning whoever built it had access to detailed biomedical data on 2 allied species that was, under Concord law, classified at the highest tier. That ruled out a lone actor. That implicated someone with council-level clearance. Someone inside this assembly authorized that data's release, Counselor Amarai said, and the temperature of the room dropped several degrees at once. Which means the ambassador wasn't killed by an outside threat. He was killed by something with a seat at this table. Ren, still under guard, said nothing when this was announced, which Enforcer Marshal Ashuin immediately flagged as suspicious, until Vex pointed out, quietly, that the human had already suspected exactly this, days ago, and had simply been waiting for the room to catch up. You knew, Ashuin said, rounding on him. You knew this was an inside act and you said nothing during 6 hours of questioning. I told you I read the file, Ren said. I read all of it. I've had 6 months as Senak's bodyguard to notice patterns nobody in this assembly had time to notice, because none of you were in the room every single day watching who flinched when his relocation numbers came up. I didn't withhold that because I'm hiding something, Enforcer Marshal. I withheld it because an accusation without proof gets the accuser killed faster than it gets the guilty party caught, and I was not going to hand a killer inside your own council a reason to finish the job before I had something solid enough to survive contact with people like you. People like me. People who need incentives before they'll believe a threat is real, Ren said. I've met a lot of you. It never ends well for whoever's still waiting to be believed. This was the second misinterpretation, and it cut the room in half. The council had assumed Ren's silence meant either guilt or incompetence. It had, in fact, meant the opposite, a man doing the slow, unglamorous, thankless work of protecting a case that hadn't been ready yet, at the cost of 6 hours of looking exactly as suspicious as a murderer would. The mid-story break arrived not as a confession, and not as new forensic data, but as an accident of translation, the kind of small administrative failure that nobody in that chamber would have thought to question if a junior linguistics officer hadn't happened to be running a routine accuracy audit on the hearing's live transcript at the exact moment it mattered. Counselors, the officer said, hesitant, interrupting a room that did not appreciate being interrupted, there's a discrepancy. The human's original contract, the payment clause. It wasn't translated correctly into Concord Standard when it was filed 6 months ago. Explain, Vex said. The original was in a mixed Ithrenic standard dialect, the kind Ambassador Senak used for informal contracts with outside staff. The filed translation renders the compensation clause as to be determined upon completion by the client's own judgment. That's accurate as far as it goes. But it drops a modifying phrase. The full original clause reads, the officer hesitated, checking the source text twice before committing to it aloud, to be determined upon completion by the client's own judgment, in the event the client survives to render one. The room went silent in a way that felt, to Vex, entirely different from every silence that had come before it. He never expected payment, Amarai said slowly. He drafted the clause to fund itself only if Senak lived, which means for 6 months, this human has been working an open-ended, high-risk protection contract with a compensation structure that only pays out on success, and every single day he stayed on that assignment, he was gambling his own earnings against the ambassador's survival. That's not a security contract, Ashuin said, and for the first time, his voice had lost its edge of certainty. That's not how mercenaries structure risk. No rational operative ties their own payment to an outcome that dangerous. He's not the one behaving irrationally, Enforcer Marshal, Vex said quietly, staring at the corrected clause on the display, feeling the entire shape of the last 6 hours rearrange itself around a fact that had been sitting in plain, mistranslated sight the whole time. We are, for assuming that risk this severe requires an incentive at all. This was the rehook, and it detonated backward through everything the council thought it understood. Ren Caswell had not taken an undervalued contract because he lacked better options. He had structured the terms so that the only way he ever got paid was if he succeeded completely, and had lived, for 6 months, inside a bet that guaranteed him nothing unless a man he barely knew survived long enough to decide, personally, what his life had been worth. It was not altruism exactly, and it was not commerce exactly. It was something the Concord's entire economic and military doctrine had no clean category for. A being who had made his own survival strategy contingent on someone else's. Ashuin, staring at the translated clause, said the thing that would follow him for the rest of his career. He built a contract that could only ever punish him for failing. Why would any operative do that? Ask him, Vex said. They did. Ren's answer was short, and it was the first time all day his composure fully, visibly cracked. Because Senek asked me what I thought his work was worth on the day I signed, and I told him I didn't know yet, that I'd tell him when I found out whether it mattered. His jaw tightened. I didn't get to find out. He's dead. I don't get paid, counselors, because I never actually finished the job I took. I failed the only metric that clause was ever built around, and no amount of council gratitude is going to change what that clause says about what I owe myself for it. Ashuin was not ready to let the matter rest there. He requested and was granted a private interview with Run before the council reconvened, ostensibly to clarify the contract's translation error for the official record. Vex watched the exchange from an adjoining observation room, uneasy in a way she could not immediately name. You could have told us about the payment clause yourself, Ashuin said, pacing the small room while Rin sat, still and unhurried, exactly as he had for 6 hours. Instead you let a junior linguist stumble onto it by accident. Why? Because it wasn't evidence of anything except how I run my own affairs, Rin said. I wasn't hiding it to look virtuous, Enforcer Marshal. I was hiding it because it's mine. There's a difference between concealment and privacy, and your assembly hasn't figured out yet that those aren't the same crime. Everything a suspect withholds during a capital hearing is, by definition, a liability to himself. Then I accepted the liability. Ren's voice didn't rise. Some things aren't for sale and some things aren't for display either. My reasons for taking that contract belong to me, whether or not they clear me faster. Ashuin studied him for a long moment, and something in his posture, Vex would only recognize it afterward, replaying the footage, was not suspicion anymore. It was the particular, unsettled stillness of a being watching a variable behave in a way his models insisted was impossible, and finding no comfort in finally being shown proof. You would have let yourself be convicted, Ashuin said slowly, rather than volunteer a detail that made you look sympathetic. I'd have let myself be convicted rather than perform grief for a room that wanted a show, Rin said. There's a difference. Senak's dead. Nothing I say in this building brings him back, and I wasn't going to turn what he meant to me into a piece of testimony for people who spent the last 6 hours deciding whether I was worth believing. For the first time, something sharp entered his voice. You wanted proof I wasn't calculating an angle. I never had an angle to calculate. That's not a defense strategy, Enforcer Marshal. It's just the truth, and I don't especially care whether it's convenient for your case. It was this exchange, more than the corrected contract clause, that would later trouble Ashuin most in the private reports he never filed. A being who withheld a fact that could have shortened his own suffering, not out of strategy, not out of fear, but simply because the fact belonged to him and to no one else, did not fit any interrogation model the Dravith Intelligence Service had ever built. Ashuin had spent 11 years learning to find the transaction hiding beneath every claim of principle. He was beginning, quietly, to suspect that this particular claim had no transaction underneath it at all, and the thought unsettled him more than any weapon could have. The investigation accelerated from there, each new fact worse than the one before it. The precise, compounding dread the council had not braced for, the growing, sick certainty that a killer with council-level access had not finished what they started. A second attempt came 4 hours later, a modified atmospheric scrubber in the detention wing, the same Cortexan signature, traced, this time, not to Senak's shuttle, but to the ventilation system 15 meters from Ren's holding cell. He should have died. By every calculation Ashuin's own security teams ran afterward, the dosage in that corridor was sufficient to kill a human in under 6 minutes. Ren was found 40 minutes later, alive, having dragged 2 unconscious Concord guards clear of the contaminated section before the toxin fully incapacitated him, guards who owed him nothing, who had spent the day treating him as a murder suspect, whom he had no professional or contractual obligation to save. Why? Ashuin demanded, when Ren was finally stable enough to speak, voice raw from the exposure. Would you spend your own remaining strength on beings who arrested you 6 hours earlier? Because they were unconscious and dying and I was the only one standing, Ren said, and there was no performance left in his voice at all, just simple, exhausted fact. I don't run a different set of rules for people who've been kind to me, Enforcer Marshal. That's not generosity. That's just the floor. Everything above the floor is optional. The floor isn't. This was the third misinterpretation, and it was the one that finally, permanently altered how Ashuin understood the species sitting in front of him. He had assumed human ethics operated on the same transactional logic every Concord species used: kindness extended in proportion to kindness received, risk taken in proportion to expected return. He discovered, watching a half-poisoned human explain, with visible confusion at even being asked, why he'd risked his life for two strangers who'd been actively hostile to him hours before, that some humans simply did not calculate that ledger at all. The floor, for Ren Caswell, was not a negotiated minimum. It was simply where the person stopped, full stop, with no clause requiring reciprocity. Ashuin sat with that realization for a long time afterward, alone, in a way that Concord officers of his rank rarely allowed themselves to be witnessed doing. By hour 12, the toxin's second appearance had done what 6 hours of testimony could not. It had turned the council's suspicion entirely away from Ren and onto itself. Whoever did this, Amarai said, addressing the full assembly now, voice unusually tight, attempted to eliminate a witness inside our own detention wing. That is not the work of an outside actor exploiting a gap in security. That is the work of someone who still has access, still has motive, and is now, demonstrably, willing to escalate. It was Vex who finally connected the last piece, not through forensics, but through the simple, stubborn act of rereading Senak's relocation files line by line, the tedious, unglamorous work that no one else on the council had thought worth their personal attention, until she remembered a human sitting quietly in a corridor telling her that mattering wasn't the same as being important. The 11,000 refugees, she said slowly. Senak's relocation program. It wasn't a minor diplomatic project. It was moving people off a border world the Assembly quietly agreed, 3 years ago, to abandon to Dravith territorial expansion in exchange for a resource concession none of us ever brought to open vote. She looked up, and the room went cold around her words. Senak found out. His relocation program wasn't humanitarian relief. It was an evacuation of people this council had already privately signed away. Every eye in the chamber turned, slowly, to Enforcer Marshal Croth Ashuin. He did not run. He did not deny it with the immediate, reflexive outrage of an innocent being falsely accused. He simply sat very still, the way a species does when a calculation it has run 100 times finally, publicly, fails to balance. The concession secured resources for 400,000 Concord citizens, Ashuin said quietly. 11,000 border refugees against 400,000 secured lives. I ran that arithmetic honestly, counselors. I would run it again. You murdered 6 people and tried to murder a 7th to protect an equation, Vex said. I protected an outcome, Ashuin said. The ambassador was going to make that trade public. It would have collapsed the concession, endangered 400,000 lives to save 11,000, and I made the decision every rational actor in this chamber has been trained, for generations, to make in exactly that situation. His gaze moved, finally, to Ren, and something almost like genuine confusion crossed his face. I do not understand why one human mercenary, protecting one aging diplomat on one unimportant post, was the single variable in this entire equation I failed to correctly calculate. Ren, still pale, still recovering, met his eyes without flinching. Because you were calculating which lives were worth more, he said. I was never doing that math at all. Amarai, watching Ashuin taken from the chamber, turned to Ren with an expression the first speaker had not worn in 400 years of unbroken diplomatic composure, something close to humility and close to fear at the same time. You said, in the corridor, that you were never doing the same math he was, Amarai said. I have led this assembly for longer than your species has held a seat at this table, and I confess I do not fully understand the math you were doing instead. There wasn't any math, Rin said. That's the part nobody in this room seems able to hold on to. You keep asking me what the calculation was. There wasn't one. A man hired me to keep him alive long enough to finish something decent. Said yes. Everything after that was just showing up, one day at a time, for as long as it took. He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment the exhaustion in him was total, unguarded, entirely without performance. I understand that frightens you more than an actual weapon would. I've watched it frighten people like you before. You can prepare for force. You can model force. You cannot model someone who simply decided and never once revisited the decision, no matter what it cost him. Enforcer Marshal Ashuin ran an equation that killed 7 people to save 400,000, Amarai said quietly. And you are telling this assembly that the correct response was never to run the equation at all. I'm telling you the equation is how you ended up with a counselor willing to gas his own colleagues, Rin said. Somewhere along the way, weighing lives against each other stopped feeling like a last resort and started feeling like governance. I'm not smarter than anyone in this room. I don't have a better formula. I just never started using one, and I'd like to think that's not a flaw in my species. I'd like to think it's the one thing you can't afford to lose in yours. Amarai said nothing for a long moment. When the first speaker finally spoke again, it was not to Ren, but to the assembly at large, and the words would be quoted in Concord policy debates for years afterward, though rarely with any comfortable resolution attached to them. We built our peace on 400 years of careful, defensible arithmetic, Amarai said. I have never, until today, had to ask whether the arithmetic itself was the failure. This was the turning point, and it arrived exactly when the story's own pressure had built high enough to make it land, not a battle, not a rescue, but a single sentence that forced an entire council to confront the fact that the being they'd spent 12 hours suspecting had operated, from the very first moment, on a logic their civilization did not possess a framework for, one that did not weigh lives against each other at all, that treated the floor of decency as non-negotiable regardless of the numbers on either side of it. It should have felt like victory. It did not. Ashuin was taken into custody without resistance, and the assembly moved, within the hour, to begin the slow, ugly work of unwinding a 3-year-old concession built on a calculation that 11,000 border lives had been an acceptable rounding error. It was not a clean resolution. Vex would spend months afterward learning just how many other quiet arithmetic decisions like it were buried in the Concord's administrative history, decisions nobody had questioned because nobody had been in the room insisting, out loud, that some numbers didn't belong on a ledger at all. Anrin Caswell, technically exonerated, technically owed nothing by a dead man's contract that had never triggered its own payout, sat alone afterward in the same corridor where Vex had first found him, hands folded, staring at nothing, having spent 6 months and nearly his own life protecting a mission that had, by the letter of his own terms, still ended in failure. The assembly wants to compensate you, Vex told him. Formally. Beyond the contract. You saved this council from itself. I didn't save the ambassador, Rin said. That was the job. Everything since then has just been cleanup. You uncovered a conspiracy that would have gone unpunished for years. You saved 2 guards who'd arrested you. You nearly died twice in the same day for people who owed you nothing. None of that was the job, Rin said, quiet and immovable. I don't take payment for things I didn't actually finish, counselor. That's not humility. It's just how I keep score. He finally looked up at her, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was something unguarded in his face. Not composure, not restraint, just plain, unhidden grief. He was 73 years old and he spent his last 6 months trying to save people nobody else in this galaxy thought were worth saving, and I was standing 4 rooms away when someone finally killed him for it. That's what I carry out of this, counselor. Not gratitude. Not a payout. Just the 40 minutes I didn't get back. There was one more cost, and it was the one nobody thought to warn Run about until it was already too late to soften. The relocation manifest, the 11,000 names Senak had died protecting, had been quietly frozen the moment his shuttle went dark, a standard Concord safeguard meant to prevent tampering during an active investigation. For 12 hours, while the council argued jurisdiction and Oshuan's conspiracy unraveled in slow, humiliating pieces, the freeze had also halted every relocation transport already in transit. 3 ships, carrying just under 900 refugees, had been ordered to hold position in open space rather than complete their approach to the resettlement colony, a bureaucratic reflex, technically lawful, that nobody in the chamber had thought to flag as urgent while a murder investigation consumed every available resource. One of those ships had a hull fault. It had been scheduled for repair on arrival. It did not survive the extra 12 hours of holding pattern in a debris corridor it should never have been idling in. 41 people did not make it. Ren learned the number the same way he learned everything else that day, quietly, without being told directly, by reading a casualty log left open on a terminal nobody thought to close in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone in that chamber of negligence, though the accusation would have been fair. He simply sat down for the first time since the hearing began, without being asked to, and did not speak again for a long time. "That wasn't your failure," Vex said, finding him there afterward. "The freeze was standard protocol. No one on this council ordered those ships held as an act of malice." "I know," Rin said. "That's almost worse. Nobody has to be cruel for this to happen. The system just has to be busy protecting itself from a different problem, and 41 people become a rounding error in the paperwork nobody had time to prioritize." He looked at her, and there was no accusation in it, only exhaustion so complete it had stopped resembling anger. "I didn't take this job to win an argument about which lives count more, counselor. I took it because I thought if I stayed close enough, long enough, fewer people would end up as the acceptable cost of somebody else's math. I was wrong. I was only ever one man in one room. The math finds a way through regardless." It was the closest he came in the entire affair to admitting defeat, and it was, Vex would reflect later, the moment that finally, fully explained why he had refused every offer of payment or ceremony. Victory, to Ren Caswell, was not a status the council could confer. It was a number of names still breathing at the end, and the ledger, by his own accounting, would never again come out clean. The Concord's final act in this affair, when it came, was not a punishment or a reward. It was a reclassification, a small, procedural act that would ripple through council policy for a generation, because Vex Ilbrin, in the closing session, refused to let the matter close as a completed case file the way everyone else in that chamber wanted it to. "We keep a category," she told the assembly, "for operatives motivated by profit. We keep one for those motivated by ideology, and one for those coerced by circumstance. We have never once needed a category for a being who structures his own survival to depend entirely on someone else's, expecting nothing back if he succeeds and accepting everything if he fails. We need one now. Not because it will help us predict humans." She paused, and something in her voice, carefully, deliberately, refused to make the moment smaller than it was. "Because it won't. That is precisely the point. We cannot model a species whose ethics do not participate in the same arithmetic as ours. We can only, from now on, know to expect it." The category was never given an elegant name. The Concord's Records Office, after 11 drafts, simply filed it under a designation that would outlast every counselor in that room: unlisted, non-transactional risk. It applied, eventually, to a small but growing file of cases across a dozen systems, nearly all of them human, nearly all of them describing the same pattern in different uniforms and different languages, someone showing up for a job too small to matter, and staying long after the ledger stopped making sense. Ren Caswell left the council chamber the same way he'd entered it. Quietly, without ceremony, without collecting the compensation the assembly tried 3 separate times to press on him. He took, in the end, only one thing: a data slate containing the full relocation manifest of the 11,000 border refugees Senak had spent his last 6 months trying to save, now finally, formally protected under Concord law. He read every name on it. It took him most of a night. Nobody ever asked him why, and he never explained it to anyone who did. Years later, when new Concord officers were briefed on the unlisted designation during their induction, They were shown, without exception, the same closing footage. A human mercenary walking alone down an empty assembly corridor, having just declined payment for saving a council that had spent an entire day treating him as a suspect, carrying nothing out of that chamber but a dead man's list of names. The briefing officers would tell them what the council had eventually, painfully, come to understand, that humans were not dangerous because they fought harder, or endured more, or calculated risk more cleverly than anyone else in the galaxy. They were dangerous because somewhere in their history, scarce and short and brutal enough to teach the lesson permanently, they had decided that some debts don't need a ledger to be worth paying, and that a species willing to bankrupt itself, quietly, without asking anyone to notice, for people who could never pay them back, was a species that could not be bought, could not be modeled, and could not, under any known framework of galactic power, ever be fully predicted. The last line of every briefing was always the same, delivered without embellishment, because none was needed. Somewhere, still, on a border world that 400,000 strangers had once quietly agreed was an acceptable price to pay, 11,000 people were alive who were never supposed to be, because one quiet man had decided, long before anyone asked him to, that matching was never something you were